Will you pray with me one more time? Gracious God, we give you thanks for the gift of your word, for the privilege of being able to come to this place and sing our praises and offer ourselves before you as we seek to interpret your word now, O God. Be with us, guide us, help us, and protect us, that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts together will be acceptable in your sight. For you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So some of you may have noticed that a lot of the Psalms we've been looking at in this summer in the Psalms. Did you miss hearing that last week? I know you did. I've had the elder read the whole Psalm. Becky, you need to thank me. 72 verses. 72 verse Psalm on Psalm 78. You all can thank me now, too, for not having to read the whole Psalm. We'd still be listening to that and lost somewhere in the midst of it. And this Psalm is, I hope sometime you will sit down and read the whole of it, because I chose to just start with the introduction. Now, I have to confess, I started with a completely ulterior motive to where I finished for this week. So I'm going to tell you both. I knew it was Blessing of the Backpackers today. And I saw this 4-verse phrase, "Give ear, O people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth." And I thought, that's a little prayer for teachers and students that will learn from them. And I kind of thought maybe that's where I was going to be going with all this, but God has a funny way of saying, no, you're not. That's not at all where this is going. So I'm not so sure that the title slide matters at all at this point. This is where I also remind you that I picked those titles like 4 months ago. And the world continues to turn during that time. And funny things happen. So if I almost made a bunch of phone calls and changed the title, but I got over it. Because I realized it after the bulletin was printed. Oh yeah, that is what I called that way back when. And it was already done, so I just left it alone. What I might have titled it instead is Remember. Remember when school supplies were a notebook and a pencil? Maybe an eraser. Yeah, a separate eraser in addition to what was on the end of that pencil. Remember when everyone brought their lunch? Not all of us remember that one, because there was no cafeteria service. Remember when school was big because it had 4 rooms? Oh, now I'm getting up there in age a little bit, aren't I? I don't remember that one. Martha, I do. Remember when nobody drove to school? When we start talking about school and remembering, this psalm actually applies. Because what this very long psalm is a teaching psalm to help the Israelite children remember what is important. If you read this through, it is a rehearsal of all of the history of the Hebrew people, especially the most important story of the Hebrew people, which Bible study people is the Exodus. Very good, thank you. Woo. That was the hardest question of the day. You're going to be just fine. The most important story of the Hebrew people, and then the continuing stories up to the reign of King David, when, of course, most of the Psalms were written. I find it amusing that this psalm, if you read it in its entirety, I'm going to jump all the way to verse 70 now, says this. Speaking of God, God chose his servant David and took him from the sheepfolds, from tending the nursing ewes. He brought him to be the shepherd of his people Jacob, of Israel, his inheritance. With upright heart he tended them and guided them with skillful hand. That's the last of Psalm 78. And it tickles me every time I read it, because the author of this psalm, who set out to create a teaching song to remind people who they are and whose they are, throws in this last little bit that, okay, half step backwards. David aggressively influenced the formation of the Psalms. So I have no doubt that the psalmist put in these last 3 verses to make darn sure the guy that was the decision maker on whether or not it would make the book would make sure it made the book. Nice little flattery for the guy, for the editor, right? And so in this psalm, we have this teaching. We have the story of Israel. We have the reminder of who we are. My father used to tell me the story of how he departed the house most weekends. As he was getting ready to leave to go do things with friends, or ironically, because it was of that era, probably with my mother, because they dated in high school, his father would always look at him and say, "Remember who you are, and remember who you're representing." I'm thinking about rebirthing that in our household as our children go out and about and do things. Just a little reminder, remember who you are and who you represent. And I wanted to focus on that as I thought about this psalm as a teaching tool of reminding young Israelites, young members of the house of Jacob, of who they are, of whose they are. That as we come into this week, we are going to encounter people who drive through that driveway, who park in that parking lot, who walk toward this building, who have spent the last couple of years perceiving that all Christians believe and act the way they are seeing things on TV. Remember who you are and who you're representing. Because we are a body of believers, for, as Bob said it this morning, for whom all means all. Everyone who walks through these doors deserves to be welcomed as a child of God, even if they don't know it yet. Perhaps especially if they don't know it yet. This week, as we were preparing, as we were stuffing backpacks, as is probably more common than I care to think, one of the conversations we got into was the nature of the complaints that we get from people who are getting something free. Right? And it's okay to chuckle a little nervously about that, because we've all, over 10 years, I suspect all of you have had some encounter to that degree. I can't even imagine, because I've never spent any time over at the food tent, what that part's like when a vegetarian walks up, even though we are prepared for them, and gets militant about a hot dog. But I'm sure it happens. Look at them nodding knowingly and chuckling just a little bit. I know I have experienced the high school student who's upset that that $120 calculator is not in their backpack. But you what? You didn't get my list and fill it for me? and having to say to them, I would love to be able to put one of those calculators in every backpack. I really, truly would. As a parent, I know what happens in our household every 5 years when you go, gee, I sure wish we could have found Roberts instead of having to go buy another one of these. Or, what do you mean TI came out with the 81C instead of B? Right? And yet, oh wait, where's my math teacher? Let me give her a really good look on that one. Not that, I don't know if you're asking for that yet. You're junior high, right?
We'll have Algebra 1.
Oh, okay, so you will have those. Fun times. That is a machine I truly do not know how to run. My kids would come. Ryan came to us this past year, and I said, go ask Robert. And if Robert doesn't know, we'll take you to church and you can go ask Angela, because we don't have a clue how that machine works. Sorry. My calculator, I'm young enough, my calculator did have plus and minus and multiply and divide, which I know some of you are like, my calculator did this. When I took physics, my calculator slid like that too. Okay, now a complete aside. I promise it won't take long. My dad worked for Texas Instruments, and he worked on the very first handheld calculators. I was telling Dick this story this week. And I remember him sitting at the kitchen table, running calculations on the prototype, and then checking them with his slide rule to see if the machine was right. And I thought, that's fascinating. That's going to be really fascinating. That's going to be a good story. I had no idea I would ever be preaching at that point, and that story might be helpful in some way. But it is, because checking the results of how we are being with a rule is worth noting. In this case, it's the golden one. As we prepare to meet folks that may not be as thankful, as gracious as we wish they were, we need to pause and remember that there's probably something else affecting that. There might be a medical bill that is overwhelming. There might be a car that is rusting out in its bottom. There might be a child that still needs clothing and shoes and the 5 more things that I was just hoping and praying would be in this pack that we had no idea. And God forbid we hear about the 10 boxes of Kleenex and the 5 boxes of Clorox wipes, which we'll hear about, and that's okay. Because that's not what we're here for. We're here to remember that God calls us to find ways to meet people's needs in practical ways so that we can share with them the love of Jesus Christ. I hope and pray more than anything that every one of you this week gets one opportunity to Elder, make sure Nancy is okay, please. Someone.
She is.
Okay. Thanks, Nancy's elder. Are you Nancy's elder?
No.
Oh, never mind. Outstanding. Gosh, and that was such a momentum line, too. I hope and pray that this week, every single one of you, as you volunteer, as you give of yourself, as you care for others, gets the opportunity to answer the question, why do you do this? And just in case you're not sure of the answer, which I know you are, we do it because God has touched our lives through Jesus Christ. And this is a way to touch other people in Christ's name. Do I need to repeat that for those of you taking notes? Guess not. We do this because we remember who we are and whose we are. It's going to be a hard week. This time next week, we're going to be dog tired. And we're going to trudge ourselves out of bed and come to church so we don't feel guilty that we're scrambling to an empty room with just Sarah and Rick. And we're going to look for a good word of both celebration and encouragement. And God will provide that word. But in the meantime, we're going to thank God that we are blessed to be a blessing. And we remember who we are, whose we are, and that we have a chance to represent Christianity in a wonderful, helpful way. May all the glory be to God. Amen.